Pride and Protest would like to acknowledge that the forum where this recording was made took place on the stolen land of the Gadigal peoples. Sovereignty was never ceded. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We acknowledge the crucial role of advocating for land back and Aboriginal self-determination in our activism. This particular discussion highlights the importance of fostering solidarity and supporting the Black sovereignty movement in the lead up to and after the Voice to Parliament referendum. I'm Rowan, I go by they, them, and I'm one of the Pride and Protest collective organisers. This episode potentially marks the first in a series of recordings from the weekend conference held by Pride and Protest called Provocations, which happened earlier in the month of July. For this forum I facilitated, we had Keiran Stewart-Assheton, Yuin man and the national president of the Black People's Union, or the BPU, and Seth, a member of the Australian Student Environmental Network, or ASEN, and Black Flag Sydney. As our panellists, Keiran will be the main speaker in this forum, and both are very knowledgeable about the Voice to Parliament, a proposed advisory body for Indigenous peoples. However, as we will hear from this discussion, this voice doesn't represent community and acquiesces Black peoples into a colonial constitution that could impede on unceded Aboriginal sovereignty. Attendees of the forum were advised to explore the BPU's voice class, which can be accessed through the link provided in the show notes or on our link tree available on our social media pages. We highly recommend watching this class and following the BPU on social media to stay informed about the voice and the statement from the heart. This will help you understand what's going on, as this recording only covers a limited amount of the discussion surrounding the voice's origins and purpose, because I forgot to record the session and it was only 20 minutes into this forum that another organizer remembered to start recording. So without further ado, this is the first forum of the Provocations Conference, Truth, Treaty and Trickery, co-hosted by Pride and Protest, the Black People's Union and the Australian Student Environmental Network.
If you go back over the last 30, 40 years, you look at the long-term stats on a graph of deaths in custody, of child removal, of all the impacts that we have as Aboriginal people, what you actually find is that our stats get worse under Labor governments. They don't get better under Labor governments. You'd think they'll get worse under Liberal governments, but they actually don't. They get worse every time Labor is in charge. Labor is not out there to help us. They're not out there to help the working class. They're just another front for capitalism, pushing colonial interests at the end of the day. Now, part of the reason why they impact us so much more than the Liberal government is because at the end of the day, the Liberal government couldn't give a shit either way. They're not going to fund programs. They're not going to introduce new programs. They're not going to do anything like that. So it's going to remain the status quo while they're in power. When Labor comes in, they put all this funding into all these different departments and all these different initiatives. But these departments and initiatives are just, again, paternalistic. And they're not done with consultation of community. They're not done in a self-determinant way. They're done in a way where, again, we have this benevolent white person coming in, dictating our affairs to us, knowing what's best for us. And in their mind, what that means is removing more of our children, locking up more of our people, causing more deaths in custodies. That's the end result that happens every single time. So that's just more reason as well, I suppose, why I am so opposed to this, even though it is seen as some so-called progressive Labor initiative. There is no such thing as a progressive Labor initiative when you actually look at the stats. Yeah, sorry, I've gone completely off topic. What was the original point?
I guess just why the government are trying to push this voice, and it hinges on a discussion on the Labor strategy to look like what you're talking about.
So it's at the end of the day, to summarize it, they're pushing this to undermine any attempts that we have at self-determination and enforcing our sovereignty, and that's what it is. But the second half of it is, that's the voice itself, the advisory body. Another big thing, though, is the constitutional recognition aspect. Now, as I was saying before, they're pushing this because it's a way of legally ceding our sovereignty. But here's another thing too, right? They've talked about how our sovereignty is not going to be impacted by this proposal. And, all these so-called deadly lawyers have come out, even, deadly black lawyers have come out talking about, it's not going to impact our sovereignty. Now, that is because they're using a different version and a different definition of sovereignty to what the government uses and to what actual sovereignty is. When they talk about sovereignty, they talk about sovereignty in some romanticized spiritual notion. Now, don't get me wrong, like we do have, I suppose you could say, spiritual sovereignty as blackfellas, but that is not the only sovereignty we have. Our sovereignty is much more than that. Our sovereignty fits every single criteria of what international law defines sovereignty as. Now, they're pushing this whole angle of it won't impact our sovereignty, but it will, and it will in two ways. Now, first off, it's going to legally impact our sovereignty, as I was talking about before, under international law, and we're seen as acquiescing and ceding our sovereignty if we participate in this referendum and, if you get this yes vote, even though at the end of the day, anyone who looks at that ethically or objectively would know that that's BS. How can 97% of a population and 98.7% of a voting population decide to cede someone else's sovereignty? It's the exact same if you look at in terms of the ratio and the percentages. It's the exact same as if China was to turn around and say, we're going to hold a referendum on whether or not to cede Australia into China's sovereignty, but we'll give the Australians the ability to vote as well, even though the Australian voting population will count for less than 2% of all the votes in that referendum. But, hey, it's fair because we gave them the chance to vote as well and they participated and it's democratic. Like that's the exact same thing that is happening, to put it more bluntly. You know what I mean? That's what's happening when you have literally 98.7% of the voting population deciding on the affairs of 1.3% of the voting population. Another big thing as well, when we look at the votes and we look at how it's being pushed, is manufactured consent. At the end of the day, this isn't a proposal that's been done with free, prior and informed consent, which is a mandatory obligation under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Australia is a signatory to that. They have been since 2007 or something like that, I believe. That being said, though, they haven't ratified it into their law, so it's not something that can actually be pushed or challenged here. So, that's not something that we can rely on. Not that we could anyways, even if it had been pushed. Blackfellas can't appeal to the United Nations. We are seen as a domestic entity as far as the United Nations is concerned and not our own sovereign state. So we have no recourse to actually bring anything before the United Nations. But yeah, sorry, I keep going completely off tracks here. But there's so much to rave on about and I can just rave on for ages. So please do feel free to let me know if you want to go to another question.
Yeah. Well, I'm not on track of time. I should have my phone on me. But Seth, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah. Oh,
no. Yeah, certainly. And I guess the standpoint from this whole conference as well is comrades from the People Collective can jump in when we have audience discussion. But it's Labor's strategy is to window dress and look like that they're doing something when in actuality they're making things worse. And it hinges on a discussion that's happening around state New South Wales and the Equality Bill, and also with the Business Council of Australia and Equality Australia, is they're trying to perform dialogue with Parliament about making an advisory body for people of marginalized genders or sexuality, a gay voice, effectively. And yeah, it's this whole discussion on there's this whole discussion on how they're trying to window dress and do all this stuff when they don't have any veto power and they're not really there to help minorities at all. So yeah, that's really what I had to add to that. I guess the final question before we get into audience discussion is what does, and you've probably covered lots of this already, but what does the voice mean for real Indigenous struggle? Like, what does it mean for land back? What does it mean for self-determination? And like, you know, the true aims of Indigenous struggle. And you can like explore those definitions and terms if you like as well. Yeah.
So the voice is not something that can help any of those things. It is a way to prevent progress in all of those things. It's not going to lead to land back or land rights. It's not going to lead to a treaty. It's not going to lead to any form of self-determination. It's going to prevent all of those things from coming forward. So like when we look at, for example, you know, we look at land rights. Now, there is no way the voice can push for land rights. Even if the voice did happen by some miracle to be completely made up of blackfellas that actually spoke on behalf of community, that actually came from community, they wouldn't be able to do anything. They can make, I think it's 3 submissions per year to Parliament. Parliament doesn't have to act on those. They don't even have to listen to them. They don't even have to read it if they don't want to, you know what I mean? Like, the minister can just print that out, scrunch it up, chuck it in the bin. There's no way to force them to act on any of that. And, you know, when we look at other things as well, like, you know, the quote unquote gay voice, and we look at other previous things that have come for other minority groups from, you know, Labor governments and other governments in the past, what we see is cultural war attacks that don't need to happen in the first place. So when we look at the marriage plebiscite, the government didn't need to have a plebiscite to legislate gay marriage. They could have done that without taking it into the public domain. But by putting it into the public domain, what they're doing is creating these culture wars where they're dividing up the working class and they're isolating minorities and they're fueling hate. This voice proposition is just another one of those. And you look at what right-wingers are saying right now about the voice and about blackfellas, you know, it's some pretty disgusting, horrible things. And of course, there's all the regular propaganda chucked in there about, you know, the voice is some internationalist, globalist, communist agenda where, you know, it's going to mean that all you white fellas are going to get deported and we're going to take our land back and whatever else and stuff. And, you know, all this other nonsense that they're coming out with, which just aims to fuel the apolitical masses' hate. And it's the same with, you know, the gay marriage plebiscite. Now, one of the things that I see a lot in the discussions around the voice is that we have to vote yes. Otherwise, if we vote no, it's going to be emboldening the right and it's going to be emboldening that hate. If we look at the last 10 years, we can see that's absolute bullshit. If that was the case, then wouldn't that mean that by voting yes for the gay marriage plebiscite, that we got rid of all the hatred towards the, you know, the gender and sexual orientation diverse community? Does that mean that we've got rid of that bigotry? No, it doesn't. We here a couple of years later, after Australia, you know, voted yes and we're all progressive, you know, we like the gays. And now a couple of years later, we have literal Nazis holding anti-trans banners standing on Parliament House steps. You know what I mean? Like, did the gay marriage plebiscite end bigotry? No. Did it do anything to prevent it? No. Now, would a no vote maybe have fueled it more? Potentially. We don't know. But at the end of the day, voting yes didn't get rid of that. It didn't end that. Same thing's going to happen with the voice. Voting yes doesn't mean we're going to get rid of racism in Australia. Doesn't mean that we're going to, you know, prevent racists in Australia. It doesn't mean that we're going to prevent the emboldening of racism in Australia. An argument can be made that voting yes actually emboldens racism even more in Australia on 2 counts. One, of course, as I was mentioning before, the paternalistic racism, where, you know, by voting yes, we're all agreeing that blackfellas can't manage their own affairs. They're too dumb and incapable. We need a white fella to come manage it for them. But also by voting yes, how is that going to react? How's that going to be taken, by all of the reactionary right wing? Are they going to go, oh, well, the rest of Australia voted yes, so that means my racism's bad? They're not going to fucking do that. They're going to think, oh, these blackfellas are getting even more. I hate these blackfellas even more. And it's going to embolden that racism even more. There is no such thing as voting yes for harm reduction. Another thing as well with this whole voting yes for harm reduction is at the end of the day, and I'm sorry if people don't like to hear this, not necessarily anybody in the room, but anybody who might see this later or hear this later, but everybody who I've seen from my community pushing the vote yes for harm reduction aren't at risk of harm. They're not the ones who are most at risk. They're the people who live quite comfortable lives in the city. Now, of course, they're still oppressed and exploited working class members, the same as everybody else, but they're not the most oppressed and exploited in our communities. Whereas mob who are actually at risk of these things mob who are actually living in these regional communities where they have lynch mobs forming, where they have all these racism going on, where they have little black kids being run down in the fucking streets by white vigilantes, they're not out there saying, we got to vote yes for harm reduction. Most of the mob in those communities who are political and who are involved in this discussion are out there saying we should vote no. All the ones saying we need to vote yes for harm reduction, and I'm sorry, but you're a coward at the end of the day. You're not the one at risk. You're not the one facing the problems. You're not the one who's going to have the backlash, but you're out here pushing these yes agendas for harm reduction for your own personal reasons, not for any materialist reason. And that's what it boils down to. Yeah. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, since colonization, Aboriginal people have been using their voices to call for actual, real change, right? Look, even in the last few years, week in, week out, you have families of, those affected by deaths in custody on town hall steps, rallying, asking for actual change on this stuff. The Gomeroi up in northwest New South Wales, 97% of their community voted against Santos, yet the government's proceeding with the proposal. Albo actually scoffed when asked if the Voice would do something to stop Santos in the Pilliga, right? Just an absolute shame. And that shows what the real intention behind this Voice is. It's, as Keiran said, it's going to rubber stamp Santos. It's going to rubber stamp some meaningless change on deaths in custody. And that's really all that it's ever going to do, which is why it has so much support from the ruling class. Some of the first people to endorse the Voice way back in 2018, it was Rio Tinto, it was the Business Council of Australia. They have vested interest in something like this getting up because it's actually going to be good for them. It's, I think the term blackwashing is really like a good term to use here. You have pinkwashing and greenwashing, but blackwashing is what the Voice is. It's not going to allow the people who have actually been calling for real change for years to make any progress. It's just going to, allow the ruling class to really consolidate its power, to actually say, no, these people calling for this action are a fringe radical minority. Don't listen to them. Listen to this constitutionally enshrined voice. That's who is the authority on this. But then at the same time, it's a powerless body, which is like the sad irony of this whole thing. Let's entertain for a second that we do actually believe in, this parliamentary road to some sort of change, that we do actually think, if the right people are in power, then there will be real change. The Voice, it's still like useless because at the end of the day, it doesn't have any veto power. It can't force government to bind on any sort of position. So it's not actually going to accomplish anything.
Yeah. And just building on that as well, and the whole listening to our voices, we've got plenty of voices that are being ignored all the time. The Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody is 31 years old now, and they've done fuck all to implement that. The Bringing Them Home report was released back in 97. Again, they've done fuck all to implement that. There's our voices there. There's our self-determining voices right there giving recommendations that are being ignored again and again. Now, I actually had a meeting with Bernie 2 weeks ago with Linda Burney. I was there with the rest of the Black Sovereign movement at Parliament House. Now, we went in and we had a meeting with Bernie, and this is a meeting that we had been pushing for and that we had Senator Fort pushing for on our behalf for months to try and organise this meeting. This meeting was called that morning as a result of a bunch of blackfellas rocking up to Parliament House, getting in front of the cameras and saying, we're voting no and we're calling on everyone else to vote no and, to come support our Black Sovereign movement. Bernie decided that she would then call a meeting. We went and had a meeting with Bernie, McCarthy, and I always forget her name, but the other Aboriginal minister from the Northern Territory in the Labor government. But we went and had a meeting with the three of them. And in that meeting, they turned around and admitted that it wasn't even them who had invited us to that meeting, that they were more or less had their arms twisted to come to that meeting with us. But then as a result of that meeting, the next day, they were a bit on the back foot. They had been caught off guard. The next day, they wanted to look progressive. So what did? They introduced into Parliament that they were going to implement one of the recommendations into Aboriginal deaths in custody. Wasn't a good one though, wasn't a big one. It was the body bag count one. They're going to have a live tracker so we can see how many of our mob have died in custody and when another one dies in custody. Not anything that's going to actually stop deaths in custody. It's just, how progressive. We can now count along and see how many of our mob have died in custody. Like that's the recommendation they chose to implement. That's the sort of people that we're dealing with here. Even Albo the other day was blasting the media about, giving airtime to Aboriginals who are pushing a progressive no. But isn't this meant to be our voice? But we can't even talk about it in the media. This is the contradictions here plainly for everybody to see. Another thing, people talk about, the voice will lead to treaty. And, after the voice, then Labor will push the treaty aspect of the whole voice treaty truth. Voice was meant to be the last aspect for starters. It wasn't meant to be the first one. It was meant to be truth, treaty, voice. But now they've put the voice first, and the voice can't do anything for a treaty. The voice will be a government arm. How can the government treaty with itself? It's an oxymoron. It doesn't work that way. But not only that, again, Senator Thorpe, a couple of weeks back, pushed a motion in a matter of urgency, in the Senate, that the government would recognise as a matter of urgency that they need to progress treaty. Every single Labor person, every single Labor senator in that hall went and sat with Liberal on the no side. Every single one. Shame indeed. I think there was one other person that sat with Lydia, and everybody else, all the Greens as well, voted no. Yeah. People think the Greens are progressive. They're just as bad as Labor. Don't get me wrong. They might have some okay harm reduction policies around, like emissions and taxes. But at the end of the day, they don't actually challenge the system. They don't challenge the exploitation and oppression that exists. They just put a nice, friendly, smiley face on it. But yeah, this is the sort of people that we have in government saying that they're pushing our interests when at the end of the day, you can quite clearly see that they're not willing to listen to our voices. They don't want to listen to our voices. They've had decades of voices. Another thing as well, just I'll briefly touch on, this is not the first advisory body we've had. This is not even the 10th advisory body we've had. We've had literally dozens. They don't go back just a few years. The first advisory body was actually before Federation back in the 1800s. And then we've had successive advisory bodies since I think it was the 1940s. We've had continuous advisory bodies since. Every single Prime Minister since Hawke, every single Prime Minister since Hawke has created their own Aboriginal advisory body. Every single one. What have those advisory bodies done? Nothing. Absolutely fuck all. Our people's situation gets worse every year. Another thing, people talk about it is if we vote no, it's going to set blackfellas back 30 years. I would welcome that. 30 years ago, our stats were better than they are today. Please send us back 30 years. We'll have less deaths in custody. We'll have less child removal. That is the state of Australia today. It's not getting better. It's getting more racist every single year. We have more people die in custody every year. We have more kids removed every single year. Every time Labor comes in, that rate skyrockets. This is not progressive. This is not anything we want support with. This is not anything we want the Australian public to push. This is just another weapon in the government's toolbox against us.
We might start audience discussion. I don't know what the time is. Someone shout it. 53. All right. Yeah, that'll be good. It'll be, if it's all right, just like shout your question and I can repeat it for those that are zooming in. And yep, Mikhail. Yeah. I'll just repeat that. So someone from the audience just asked, like, is it better to abstain or to vote no, in a sense? Or like, what are your thoughts on abstaining or voting no?
I'm going to loosely paraphrase Kwame Ture here. A boycott is the most passive and weakest thing you can do. A boycott doesn't do anything. It doesn't bring about any change. All it is something simply saying symbolically that we're not participating, but it has no real material impact on anything. If anything, with this referendum in particular, a boycott actually helps to potentially push more yes votes because there's less people out there pushing no, and more people abstaining from it. Now, a boycott has no material impacts on how a referendum works. You could have 99% of the population boycott this referendum. The government will count that 1% of votes, and that's what they'll judge it off. You can go and read the Constitution yourself. It specifically states in there that they count the votes, not the voters. So at the end of the day, if they had 100 votes, that's what they would count, and that's what they would base the majority off. Boycotts do nothing whatsoever to help our situation. They're the most passive and symbolic thing that you can do with no real impact. And yeah, we do not encourage people to boycott. We do not encourage people to abstain. We encourage people to take an active approach instead of a passive approach, and to actively help us by voting no, instead of taking that passive approach of saying, I don't want nothing to do with it. If that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think to abstain is to try to ignore the question rather than confront it head on. So I think the most principled thing you can do is vote no in this instance. I think there have been a lot of people calling for boycott. I think that's out of almost fear to be labelled as part of the racist no campaign. And that's why I think it's just more important to make it clear that there is a grassroots left no campaign, and to get that to have as big a platform as possible. Then you don't need to then you can give people the confidence to not have that fear that they'll be labelled as part of the racist no campaign. I think that's where this boycott position has really emerged from. And I can see why people have come to that position, but unfortunately, I do think the most principled way about it is to go with a no.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yep. Go to the back. Yeah. So that question was essentially like, how can we be fighting in the streets? How can we be continuing to support Indigenous struggle? And either yes or no, what's gonna happen? How are we gonna continue to support Black struggle? If that was essentially your question. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. It's one that takes quite a bit to answer. There's lots of things that we need to do and that we could do, lots of potential and lots of pros and cons and obstacles, etc., etc. I suppose at the end of the day, though, like ultimately, I place no faith in any kind of reforms under capitalism. We're not going to be able to reform our way out of exploitation and out of oppression. The primary contradiction here in Australia is colonisation. We can't address that under capitalism, and as long as colonisation continues to exist. So to answer your question, I suppose what we need to do is to keep building united movements at grassroots level. We need to coordinate our strength together so that we can actually be in a position to be able to push for more, and not just push for more in an asking way, but to actually go out there and take more and demand more. So a part of what we want to do here as the BPU is we also don't believe in signing a treaty with the government for similar sort of reasons as, we're not going to be able to reform our way out or legislate our way out of any sort of exploitation and oppression. I can also talk heaps about treaties and how they're failed measures. You can look at every single colonized nation around the world and see that their treaties have failed and been broken time and time and time again. We can talk about how state legislation treaties aren't actually treaties. They're just state legislation with the word treaty in the title and stuff like that. But ultimately what we want to do is reject that treaty process as well. And we want to form inter-clan treaties in Australia so that we can unite all of our mob, have this pan-Aboriginal struggle. There is history around the world of pan African and pan-Indigenous struggles in like Africa and South America, actually being able to put up a real solid fight against colonization and actually being able to resist imperialism really powerfully. So that's what we're trying to build here in Australia. We're trying to build a pan-Aboriginal movement. Part of that, of course, is that we don't just want to have a pan-Aboriginal movement. Even if every single Blackfoot in Australia decided to jump on board, it would still be less than 3% of the population. So we also want to unite with the working class. We want to unite with different leftist groups and organizations and parties to be able to create, I know it sounds a bit fringe and cliche, but we need a united left. And at the end of the day, that's what we do need. We're not going to get anywhere as some factionalized, segregated, 100+ different little parties and organizations, each running our own races and fighting our own little individual battles. The government wants us to do that. While we're fractured and like that, we're not going to get anywhere. We might win a couple of concessions here and there, but for every concession we win, we're also going to lose a whole lot. What we need is a united struggle against the government, led, of course, with the primary contradiction of colonization being at the front of that, the forefront and center of that. Because at the end of the day, if you don't address that primary contradiction, you can't address all of the rest of it. So ultimately what we want is more people to support organizations like the BPU to get behind us, to help us with our push for change here in Australia, so we can actually get to a point where we will have the revolutionary strength to be able to actually, take back a bit of land, to enact a bit of sovereignty and a bit of self-determination, to put up a real resistance to the imperialist occupation of our lands here. Do you want to build on that?
Yeah, sure. Go back to the question. I think we need to go back to what Mob have been calling for years, and the campaigns that were very active over the last few years around, especially deaths in custody and the stuff up in the Pilliga and, everything that's been going on for the last few years. Because I think, unfortunately, this voice question has sort of paralyzed the movement a little bit. We haven't actually had, in Sydney, but there hasn't really been a deaths in custody action or, something about Santos, for example, since Invasion Day, basically. And we're now in July. So I think that is somewhat due to the fact that the voice question has been quite divisive, and it's led to a lack of action on the real issues that people have been campaigning on. So I do think there needs to sort of be a return to some of that work. I do also think, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Keiran, immediately after the referendum, I do think we should have, ideally a national day of action. That's sort of either way, if there's a yes vote that gets up, it's sort of all right, you've given us the voice. What's next? We don't really care about this. Here are the actual things we're campaigning on. And if the no vote gets up, which is looking more and more likely, it needs to be the racists can't win, basically. It needs to be, we're here, we're supporting grassroots mob who are calling for these things. This is why they voted no. And we can't let the racist right narrative sort of claim any space should the no vote get up. So I do think there needs to be immediate action following the referendum. And either way, I think there's a clear political message that we can send. So
Look, at the end of the day, whether it gets up or whether it doesn't get up, that's not the end of our fight. Our fight's going to continue well beyond the referendum. All the fight is at the moment about the referendum is trying to prevent the government having that one extra tool in their toolbox that they can use against us. That's the fight at the moment against the referendum. But ultimately, it's not the fight for our liberation either way. One thing that you actually just reminded me about that I wanted to talk about as well is this whole racist no narrative, right? And this is something I've noticed is a massive flaw of the Western left, not just in Australia, but right across the Western world. This is a flaw of the left. The left is lazy. The left sits around and it waits for the right to set the agenda, and then we act on that in a reactionary way. Blackfellas have been saying no to this constitutional assimilation crap for decades, literally decades. Uluru Statement was back in 2017. We've had 5 years to come out in opposition to this. But the left sits on their hands, they do nothing, they wait a couple of months before the referendum, the right turns around and says, well, we're going to say no. So now the left goes, oh, well, the right said this, so if we say no, we're going to be the racists as well. When's the left going to set the agenda? When's the left going to be proactive instead of reactionary? And it's not just with the voice. There's heaps of other examples I could use. Look at the COVID lockdowns. Look at how the left acted during the COVID lockdowns. Left turned into a bunch of coppers. Like, I thought we were ACAB guys, like, but here we were all the coppers. Now, don't get me wrong, there was a lot of legitimate reasons to have the lockdowns. I'm not saying the lockdowns were a bad idea, but their execution was horrible. The lockdowns really harmed the working class. Now, instead of the left seizing this opportunity to win over the apolitical masses of the working class, who are understandably upset and who are understandably frustrated and understandably confused, the left turned into coppers and allowed the right to instead seize that opportunity and to win over so many people to that cook side of the right. Now look how many cookers we have. Again, back then, the left waited for the right wing to be the proactive ones, and then we had to take the reactionary response to them being proactive. The left needs to be the proactive force if we're ever going to achieve anything. All we're doing is just running around in circles, chasing after the right, following their agenda. That is something that needs to change. Otherwise, there's going to be no change.
Yeah, I mean, just building on that, I guess what's really ironic about the voice question is that the people who walked out at the initial Uluru conference were the radical grassroots mob. Senator Thorpe and Auntie Jenny Munro were some of the leaders of that. And very quickly, the right claimed the narrative, even though it was the radical left-wing mob who walked out. And now we're on this turf where it's sort of like we have to claim back that no messaging from the racist right, even though it was, the most left-wing people at that conference who actually walked out and led that walkout.
Cool. Well, thank you for that question, Sophie. Yeah, we've got a few to put their hand up first. I think it was the person in red shirt, and then Damien, and then Evan, and then Dashi, and then someone else. Yeah. Okay. Wait, hold on. Does this work? I don't know. Hello? Okay. Just shout yeah.
Who was it? I think red shirts. I agree. No, there's no liberation for anyone completely under capitalism. I guess my question is, in the meantime, you mentioned that Indigenous people don't get any protection from the UN because the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People hasn't been probably ratified in Australia, and also that Australia doesn't recognize Indigenous sovereignty in comparison to the definition under international law, etc. My question is, I guess, should we be advocating for, rather than advocating for absorption of Indigenous voices into the colonial state and colonial legislation, should we be advocating for adoption of UNDRIP in Australian legislation in terms of, rather than collaborating with Indigenous people, as a formal acknowledgement of Indigenous sovereignty under the definition that the rest of the world sees in terms of self-determination and land back, etc.
Yeah, thank you, Damien, for that. Yeah, this would hinge onto a discussion that we might have a bit later, depending on time. Melissa, you could probably pass around that sign-up sheet as well. But yeah, like what can we be doing to build?
Yeah, great question. There's lots of stuff that we could and should be doing. There's also like lots of great examples happening already right around the continent that we can be copying and that we can, be introducing to our own communities. Something that I've found seems to have a really great impact. Uncle Coco, Wayne Wharton, he is from up in Meanjin, which is Brisbane. He is also behind the Treaty Before Voice campaign. Now, I've got to give it to Unc, man. Like he's just relentless. He is such a solid and staunch fella. He's going around Australia right now. Every couple of weekends, he goes out to a different city. He sets up his table in somewhere really busy in the city. The other week, he was down in Melbourne. He set up his table at the front of Flinders Street Station, which is like the main train station in the city. And, thousands of people every day walk past. And he was just there, just handing out flyers about the voice. And his position on it, he was there just engaging people on the street, stopping people on the street, having these quick conversations with them and just trying to push it. Like that's something that needs to happen. Like we need to get out onto the streets. We need to be talking to people, not just on the streets as well, but, on your campus, talk to people on your campus, at your workplace, et cetera, et cetera. Have these discussions. And it's okay to have these discussions because they're happening anyways. We've got people out there pushing these yes discussions in all of these places. Unless we get our foot in the door and start pushing no in these places as well, then we're giving them the platform and we're allowing that to happen without any sort of resistance. Other stuff we need to be doing is, like stuff like these panels are great to be able to, engage with people, to be able to actually answer genuine questions and hesitations people might have around the voice and, gives people some information around it. You should be, hitting the streets, doing rallies and protests. The BPU's organised a few. But, it'd be great to see some other organisations and collectives organising some as well. And it shouldn't also, here's another thing too, bit off topic, but identity politics shouldn't play much of a role in this. At the end of the day, identity politics are just liberalism. They're cancer. They're not going to help anybody. If you're a white person, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be out here pushing the no campaign. We've got plenty of white people out here pushing the yes campaign. And also, not only that, like at the end of the day, it's racist to, sorry, but it's racist to put all the labor onto us blackfellas to fight for our own liberation. If you're a true ally, get out there with your labor, get out there and support us, get out there and help us. Have these discussions, have these uncomfortable discussions, push our points, repost our stuff, show up to our rallies, our panels, our events, help us organize them, help us coordinate them. Got to take my hat off to Pride in Protest for, organizing this event and, reaching out to the BPU and getting us here to be able to talk about it today.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. And yeah, it's a great question because I'm really keen to strategize a bit more about this. I think right to date, a lot of what's been happening has sort of been on the propaganda level. So it's been a lot of, debate in public or, online discussion or, whatever. And there hasn't been as much of, like the rallying and like the protesting around this, at least in Sydney. And that's why it's really inspiring to see Uncle Coco up in Brisbane. Like he basically single-handedly picketed Albo like a few months ago. It was like pretty awesome on the question of the voice specifically. So yeah, I think, there is scope for action like that. And I really think that post-referendum, there needs to be action as well, because, it's really important to push the no question, the no argument, but it needs to be as part of, we're saying no because mob are calling for X, Y, and Z and have been calling for that for so long. So it needs to be linked to, I guess, what I call like the positive demands for change or however you want to phrase it. That's a weird way to phrase it. But yeah, it needs to go beyond just no, because I think there are a lot of people who are like, you're saying no, so what's the alternative? So there needs to be a very clear case as to what a no campaign is calling for instead. And to me, that is going back to those grassroots demands that people have had for a long time. Earlier this year and last year in the Northern Territory, traditional owners were calling for, defunding the police very, very loudly. And, that got a lot of traction. So, we can connect back to demands like that as a case as to what we should be fighting for instead. Or what we should have instead of the voice. I think that's really important to go beyond that simple like no argument.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we had Evan and then Chili and then someone else around here and then Alana. And then we might finish up with audience discussion on that. Yeah. So after Alana. Who has the mic?
I guess the speech and everything is like the section that is taken like online like I guess other things that like I'm interested in, I saw like this announcement of like the sovereign go campaign. How organized is like, and is there a group that would like to being like, yeah, we're going to be working together for like this day to force out protest. And right. All of us and around that, fight for land rights and resource domination.
Yeah, great question. So the Black Sovereign Movement is, how can I explain this? The Black Sovereign Movement has always existed since colonization, but as a collective has only very recently come about. We've been fighting our own individual battles in our own countries right across this continent for decades. What the Black Sovereign Movement seeks to do is similar to the BPU's interclan treaties, is that we want to bring mob together so that we can coordinate together and we can fight together and organize together and have a greater impact by doing so. I suppose to answer your question, though, we don't have any events called right at this time. Definitely stay tuned, though. If you're not already, go follow the Black People's Union on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or free. And, you know, just stay tuned because we will be definitely announcing events coming up. We're in the process right now of coordinating those stuff. We just haven't set any dates or anything just at the moment. But yeah, definitely stay tuned. Within the next 2 weeks, we will have some stuff out online about it. So yeah, but yeah, great question. And just in general, I suppose as well, just continue to, you know, elevate our voices where you can, continue to reshare our stuff. If there is other organizations and groups, obviously you're not right-wing ones, but you know, if there are other progressive events, definitely, you know, show up, be there, you know, add those extra numbers, try and help push it and platform it, etc., etc. But yeah, just stay tuned about the Black Sovereign movement because we will be coming out with some big stuff very soon. Yeah.
So I think it was Tilly was next. Yeah.
Seems they go to the Invasion Day rallies every year. They do the right. But they are standing with us in those fights. So it's we might have the yes bureaucrats.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a really deep and complicated question. If you know the answer, please let me know. No, look, there's lots of tactics we can try and do. I suppose at the end of the day, something that we need to recognize here in Australia is that 77% of Australians are racist, racist against blackfellas. This isn't 70% of white people. This is 70% of everybody in Australia. Doesn't matter if you're a right winger, doesn't mean if you're a leftist, doesn't mean if you're a trade unionist, whatever. 70% of people in Australia have anti-Aboriginal sentiments. What we've got to try and do is get past that. We've tried to try and, you know, get rid of that racist outlook against our people. Because at the end of the day, a lot of people simply do not want to support us. They simply do not want to support our struggles. And a lot of it too, it ties into people's material conditions themselves, whether they realize it or not. It's quite easy for activists and leftists and what have we here in Australia to, you know, talk about free Palestine, for example, and to talk about the struggle of the Palestinians and what Israel's doing to Palestine. Because when they speak out against Israel, it's not impacting their material conditions. But if you're an Australian speaking out against Australia and the colonization of Australia, it's got the potential to impact your own material conditions. And that's why so many people are supportive of, you know, these struggles overseas, but aren't actually supportive of the struggles in their own backyards because of the impact it has on their own material conditions. Now, I'm not saying that they're willingly doing this. For a lot of people, they're doing this subconsciously. But at the end of the day, that's what it boils down to. It's also very easy and convenient to talk about struggles abroad because you don't have to actually do anything. You know, you can just make some Facebook posts, rock up to a rally. You know, it's great, free Palestine. You don't actually have to fucking do anything. But to free blackfellas here in Australia and to support our liberation, you actually have to get up and do something. So it's about encouraging the working class to actually be proactive and to actually, you know, take some self-reflection as well about their own material conditions here in Australia. But at the end of the day too, another thing is and this is something that's not often talked about, right-wing propaganda, especially from the Howard era government, has played a massive role in this division and that 77%, right? To the point where a lot of the reason why people think it's going to impact the material conditions isn't actually based on the material conditions it will impact. It's based on these false lies and propaganda. So there's a lot of propaganda, for example, that, land rights means that I'm going to have an Aboriginal landlord, or, I'm going to get evicted from my house, or, et cetera, et cetera. But land rights isn't about that. And what we need to do is have these conversations in our unions and in our workplaces, et cetera, about what Aboriginal struggle actually means, how it actually impacts us, and what benefits it actually has as well. Land rights and land back would actually be the quickest and easiest way to abolish private property here in Australia, and therefore to abolish capitalism. But people don't look at it that way. And these are the conversations we need to be having with people about how these struggles intertwine, how the primary contradiction here is colonisation, and how all these other struggles are bred from colonisation. And by addressing that colonisation, we can address these other struggles. We can address housing crises by having land back. We can address education, we can address healthcare, we can address, the dry land salinity and the topsoil erosion of our agricultural pastures. We can address stuff like fracking in the Beetaloo Basin, which is going to impact not just Aboriginal communities, but the entire Beetaloo Basin. We can address stuff like the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, et cetera, et cetera. All these problems can be addressed through Indigenous struggle. But people don't realise this, and people ignore this fact and instead buy into this racist narrative about Indigenous struggle. So when I talk about, our material conditions, non-Indigenous people's material conditions, sorry, I should say, but our material conditions as well, just generally here in Australia, and about having these conversations, it's about changing those narratives and changing people's perceptions about what that actually means, and what Indigenous struggle actually means, how it actually benefits the non-Indigenous working class, and trying to win people over that way. But look, it's a hard question to answer at the end of the day. Like, I don't have a clear-cut answer for you. If there was a clear-cut answer, I'm sure we would be a lot further along right now. But yeah, there's so many ways, and it's something that you have to adapt as well to individuals. I can't give you a clear-cut answer of how we engage the non-Indigenous working class to supporting this stuff. But yeah, there's so many tactics that we can and should be trying. And just because I don't have a clear answer doesn't mean that we shouldn't go out and try new tactics. Doesn't mean we should give up. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't, be endeavoring to reach that goal. But yeah, I'm afraid I cannot give you a clear answer. It's just about, continuing to just push those narratives, to fight that propaganda, and just to, support our struggles. I don't know if you can add a bit more to that.
No, yeah, it's a super complicated question, hey. But I think a lot of it comes back down to claiming the narrative and normalizing that there is a grassroots no campaign, and people will come if they see that narrative is out there and it's, being broadcast widely. In 2020, tens of thousands of people came out to rally despite, COVID restrictions and, this sort of fear of arrest and stuff, because they were won over to the idea that, protesting will actually, could win something. And, back in 2020, again, unionists were, won over to that idea so much that people were, unions were sending contingents that would then create walls between the cops and Aboriginal people so that protests could, happen safely. So a lot of it comes back down to, having those conversations, passing those motions within the union to normalize this idea. Because, if the Invasion Day rally this year says anything, it is that people will come out and protest if they see a strong case that isn't, grounded in racism against this referendum. Before, in the lead up to Invasion Day this year, there's heaps of articles coming out about how it's going to be, the sovereign no campaign and, how bad that is. But that actually brought people out. They were tens of thousands strong, those Invasion Day rallies. We unfortunately lost that afterwards because the Yes campaign went really hard on, diminishing that achievement. But I think, to me, that shows that people will campaign against this or come out against it if they see enough momentum around a principled no campaign.
Thanks for that question. Thanks for your answers. Was there someone else that put their hand up ages back Around here, no? Yep.
Good question. Look, I'm going to start off by saying there's no such thing as a progressive yes. There cannot possibly such a thing as a progressive yes, because yes in itself is not progressive, it's regressive. But like, I get what you're saying though. Look, potentially yes, there is a lot of people who are voting yes because, you know, they think it's the right thing to do and they think it's a good thing to do and because they don't know any better. And by having those conversations with them, there is a potential to win a lot of people over to the no. There's quite a lot of people that, you know, have, for example, messaged the BPU page asking questions. You know, originally they were going to vote yes, but by having those conversations with them and by actually like explaining the reality of it and the materialistic impact of it, a lot of people can actually be won over to the no. But as opposed to like working with them for other things, if they are those sort of people, I mean, there's definitely the potential there that, you know, they can be allies for other things outside of the voice campaign. Personally, though, for me, I suppose one hesitation I have with that is that while that might be the potential case, a lot of people who are voting yes have demonstrated that they don't have principled materialist analysis and that ultimately they're going to take this, you know, harm reductionist approach to stuff. And as a result, you know, these are people that I am hesitant to work with. These are the exact sort of people who would sell you out in a revolution. These are the exact sort of people that would undermine actual real progress out of their own fear or out of their own materialist interests. So look, it's a hard question and it's something that would really depend on the individual circumstance. There's definitely a lot of people who are voting yes, that, for example, support the implementation of the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. And, you know, that's something that intersectionally we could be working together on. You know, we could be working together on, all right, you want to listen to voices? Here's a voice that you should listen to. Here's some recommendations you should listen to. And there's a potential that a lot of those yes voters, why we can't win them over to the no side, we might be able to win their support in pushing for stuff like, you know, the implementation of the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody and the bringing in the home report and, you know, other voices that already exist. There is that definite potential there. And there is something that we could work on together. I think that the government, though, in itself, the Labor government has already demonstrated they're not committed to any sort of intersectional approach to other stuff. They've already, you know, refused to implement lots of recommendations from different reports and commissions, as well as, you know, they've refused to progress treaty, et cetera, et cetera. So we shouldn't be looking to work with any government authorities in an intersectional way, but definitely, you know, in the grassroots collectives, there is the potential there to work towards concessions. But the key word here is concessions. Like that's what we'll be working towards if we were working with those sort of people. We'll be working on, you know, concessions, stuff like the implementation of Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody and bringing them home report, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add. I just feel like it's a bit of a long game winning people over to your ideas. And if, you know, they're not won over to voting no, that doesn't necessarily mean people can't be won over to, you know, radical grassroots action. So that's why I think it is really important to, you know, as soon as the referendum ends, to have immediate action and protest for sure. I guess the only other thing I'd add is that, you know, should this thing get up, which I do actually think is like still very likely to happen personally, eventually people are going to realize that it's doing fuck all to create actual change. And at that point, like those people are going to be won over to what, you know, we've been saying for a very long time. So yeah, it's a long game. The referendum isn't the be all and end all. We definitely should campaign hard on it, but like, you know, it's a starting point if anything. So yeah, I guess it's sort of like how a lot of people thought a Labor government coming into power was going to create all this great change. And now slowly more and more people are realizing, oh shit, no, the Labor Party aren't actually doing anything for us. They're not doing, there's no real action on housing or climate. And yeah, people are sort of being won over to the narrative that, you know, more radical change is sort of what's necessary. Same goes for this, I think. People will realize if this advisory body gets up, that it's doing nothing. Oh, well, it's not just doing nothing, it's actually upholding the interests of the ruling class. And at that point, it's important that there's an active and lively campaign that they can get involved with.
Thanks for that. We're gonna hear from you, your question, and then we're gonna, maybe if we have time, quickly like talk briefly about like we've got all these signatures, and we've got people interested in being a part of like this progressive no movement and like moving beyond the voice as well, to support Indigenous struggles. So I guess like my question to add on after Alana's is like, how can we be doing that? What's like going to be the physical things that we can be doing to start moving and building that movement? But yeah, what's your question?
Where we are at and where we want to go. Almost like the radical left. People want to be black. You don't want to live genuinely anti. I never reached this. On Indigenous facts. So it also needs to have a bit of a humble reflection about one of our weaknesses that we're not very good at not, you know, and Indigenous people, you know, when there are actions like those, I went side, so kind of.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, so building on that, like, what do we want to be? Like, who do we want? Like, what are we? Who are we as well? And what can we be doing to, you know, build this progressive no, I guess, and building beyond that.
Yeah, so yeah, like I was talking about before, there's lots of different tactics we could be trying to do to build around the voice and the no campaign. You know, rallies, panels, getting out there, flyering, you know, go around, print out some flyers, put them in people's mailboxes, all this sort of stuff. You know, all this campaigning is going to be happening for the yes side. They've got millions and millions of dollars in campaigning funding. You know, some of the donations, one donation alone was like $5 million. I mean, like they've literally got tens of $1 million behind the Yes campaign. We've got $1,000 in our bank account for the No campaign, maybe. You know what I mean? Like we need the support of the non-Indigenous left. We need people to be putting in their labor. We need people to be, you know, helping us to create these resources and spread these resources. But yeah, beyond the referendum as well, we need the non-Indigenous left to be supporting, you know, Indigenous struggles, class struggle, environmental struggle, all these things. And all these things are ultimately interrelated. They're all connected. They all stem from the same thing, which is capitalism, which is, you know, the colonial imperialist occupation of our nations here in Australia. And by addressing that, we can address other things. So that's what we need to build towards. And like, yeah, as Lana was saying, you know, what do we want to be? Do we want to be this left that's constantly chasing our tail, constantly trying to bring in reforms and little survival tactics so that we can, you know, continue to fight for a couple more years while actually getting nowhere? Or do we want to be a left that actually has the strength to fight properly and to actually create real change and to actually, you know, to abolish the material conditions that keep us exploited and oppressed?
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing I add is like the practice that really fun. Really important to sort of combat that. Yes. It's bad. End of the day, like somebody. Yeah, I mean, like this is like the whole time. You know,
Yeah.
but yeah, like it's just about having that struggle, having that fight.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Keiran. And thank you, Seth, as well, for your thoughts. And we do appreciate this labor. And yeah, what you've said has really like struck. I'm pretty sure it struck all of us here. And yeah, we appreciate that work that you're doing to spread the word, because it's really important. And like as we've got people, I was looking at it, like people like have flipped over the page now. We've got so many people like who want to be part of this, and want to be part of something. And I think this is sort of going to be the type of discussions that we'll be having at this conference, like engaging with you and trying to like see what problems that you want us to address, and like also start to mobilize around. And yeah, I think that like a strategy meeting or something would be really good, and we'll look over the sign up sheet and see what to do But yeah, before we wrap up and maybe have like a 5 or 10 minutes or so break, before we hear from yes, Sophie, we'll have a picture, yeah, of all of us. And is that it? Follow us on Instagram. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So just sorry, one more quick thing as well. If you want to support the BPU, by all means, jump over to our website, blackpeoplesunion.org. You can donate towards our campaigns there. Not only that, you can sign up and join if you want to. We are an Indigenous-led organisation, but we aren't an Indigenous exclusive organisation. We have an associate member category for non-Indigenous people. So yeah, if you want to jump on board, do more and actually support us, please do go sign up.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.